Greetings and welcome to another Warhammer Underworlds video, where today this is a first. It's my tactics series. I've always wanted to talk about tactics in depth. I've covered them a lot on my blog, canyonrollercrit.com, and part of the reason I've stopped doing it on the blog is because I covered pretty much the basics of everything, but also there's only so much you can talk and share stuff via just written medium. And I've always wanted, one of the main reasons I came onto YouTube in the first place was because I can feel I can better demonstrate those tactics and hints and tips via video format, because it makes more sense when you can see what I'm talking about and I can show you instead of just images with text. But today, this is a subject I've wanted to cover for a long time, but thanks to the lax in the release schedule for Warhammer Underworlds at the moment, today I'm going to talk about board placement, objective placement, and lethal hex placement. So this is going to be a long video, and the reason I decided to combine them all together is because they all overlap, each one. So board placement overlaps with objective placement, which overlaps with lethal hex placement. So as one combined video, I can more clearly and succinctly link all the subject matters together to make sure they all make sense. Because looking each in a vacuum doesn't really help. And once you watch the video, you'll understand, because they really do. All three parts link into each other. Now, in order to make this easier, I always do timestamps in the video. So if you want to check out which segment, well, let's say you only want to check out like lethal hex placement or just how to place boards, I've got that covered in the episode description. So just check for the timestamp and it will all be categorized for which subject, because first I'm going to talk about how to place boards, then how to place objectives, and then how to place lethal hexes. In addition to this, I have also got my articles which I reference as well, and if you want to just read those instead, those are fine, those are down in the episode description below. And I have my board placement article for Warhammer Underworld, which is a living article, so I regularly update it so it's always up to date. And that just covers the basics for board placement as well as categorizing what each board is. And then also I have my lethal hex placement article, which is something I wrote around the time of Beastgrave. And just basically I build off of those articles and expand. So yeah, today is going to be a long video, but it's one of those tactics videos that you really have to talk about in depth. So this is something I learned by myself. And since the days of Shadespire, it's something I've worked on and improved on. So it is going to be a long listen. There's no real way to cut it down. And if I made it short and sweet, you'd be missing out on a lot of information and I wouldn't feel comfortable talking about it. So it is long, but if you want to get better at Warhammer Underworlds, this is the kind of stuff you're going to need to watch and listen for. So without further ado, please remember to like and subscribe, as well as comment down in the episode description below what you thought of today's video, and would you like to see more tactics videos? Because if this is a huge success, I'm more than happy to make more tactics videos, as it's, once I said, part of the reason I came onto YouTube. So let's get on with the tactics video. Okay, so for this board placement part of the video, first I'll go through saying what type of board configurations there are. Because there are three main ways you can configure game boards in Warhammer Underworlds. Now, before I go further into the subject, as I've probably already covered in the intro, I would recommend reading the board article, which is linked in the episode description below. That's because it links to relevant information and covers what I'm talking about also in text format, but it's more applicable because I will be going through mainly the starter set boards, because they won't rotate. I will touch on some diachasm boards when this is recorded, but with how boards rotate, when you look at the article, it will always be up to date because that is a living article of mine and I update it regularly to show you what's legal for playing in Warhammer Underworlds competitively and for your regular games. But without further ado, let's go into the first configuration, which is wide configuration. Now, from the article, these are all confirmed by Dave Sanders, the creator of the game, and this is how they're terminized. So, wide configuration is pretty simple. You probably already do it yourself and have seen it a lot on the channel. and it's just straight on wide. There's no gap, boards just are touching from here to here. And generally, this is for aggro players, because you'll try and get a maximum frontage as much as possible, because you want to get your fighters as close to the enemy as possible. And especially if you're playing against another hold objective or warband you think is going to be quite defensive, you can easily box them in and start applying the pressure without having to worry about needing to get cards that boost your mobility, or positional cards such as push cards, like, let's say, for example, distraction or sidestep. So you don't have to worry too much, especially against elite warbands who will be sitting at the back of the board. But you can use this to punish defensive play, basically. You may not want to do it in an aggro on aggro format, but as I said, wide configuration, the most common, and generally you do it as an aggro player. So the next configuration we have is long configuration, also known as the annoying configuration. So this is something, either playable sigh when they realize this is how it's going to be set up. So why would you pick long configuration? So you may think because end to end, it's the furthest distance you can space out from your opponent. That's actually incorrect. It's still really long, but that's not how this configuration works. While it is great for the control archetype, because you will be sitting at the back of the board, giving yourself lots of time against an aggro player. So this is generally what, especially in the Shadespire days, if someone was trying to hide away from an aggro player, they would default to this board, especially if they were a free fighter elite warband, because they could effectively sit at the back of the board while you spend 1 to 2 activations getting to them. Then you basically have one round to close off the game, which could spell a lot of death in terms of the aggro player, because they won't be able to they'll get going too late. So generally used in a defensive play. But there's another way you can use this. You can actually use this as an aggro player as well. So the main ones that I've seen use longboarding like this are Thundrix Profiteers and Mollog. And you may question about why Thundrix, but that's because they have a range threat. So what you may notice is this board configuration isn't very wide. It's only 5 hexes wide. So if you are actually trying to box your opponent in, you're giving them less room to run around you. So for example, let's say you're fighting against a very good, fast, hold objective warband. You've boxed them in as the aggro player, and you can put your warbands at the front, because, your fighters at the front. Because if your hold objective player tries to run past you, they can't, on wide configuration, they can't run around your flanks quite easily, maybe having to worry about one fighter. If they try and run down any of your flanks, left or right, you now have at least 2 to maybe even 3 fighters all within threat range of that fighter trying to get into your territory to get onto an objective. So it effectively box them in and nullifies high movement, because all they can really go is backwards and forwards. So it's really good at hemming the opponent in and controlling their movement, and especially with Mollog, because he can move down the center of the board. And every time he moves, because he's got a 2 hex range attack, he's always in threat range. And it can be really punishing for the opponent if they're not used to that kind of pressure. So that's another way to use it. And the reason I talked about Thundrix Profiteers is because they all have fighters with range 3 attacks or 2 attacks. It's really good at punishing people with high movement who you want to try and box in as an aggro player. So that's one really niche use, but a good way to use long configuration. Another great way, which I will cover more in objective placement, let's say your opponent has won the roll-off and have chosen to place boards first, but you're a hold objective player. So you kind of want to prevent them from placing objectives first. So this is kind of more of a techie trick. I used to use it a lot in Shadespire when I was trying to basically punish my opponent for trying being greedy with, going long boards. The only problem is it never works twice in a row. If it does, your opponent is super gullible and amazing to you. But let's say, for example, for objectives, I want to punish the hold objective player by not letting them get 3 objectives in their territory. So let's say they do something silly and place an objective here. Normally, you would go, okay, they've got that, that's safe. So if they've put it here or even here, they've left all this space open. And it's easier if they picked a board with blocked hexes or whatever, because effectively, if you put a feature token on your second objective placement, so you could go 1, 2, 3, place an objective there, they now have to place their second objective in your territory. Because you remember, you can't place objectives on an edge hex unless it's the last activation. So all these edge hexes mess up their ability to place that second hex. Because ideally, this player would like to go, I'll place 1 objective there, I'll place 1 objective here, and then I'll place 1 objective here, and then I can place the next one somewhere along this line. If they're not prepared for that, because the way they counter that is the first time they put an objective, they put it like there. Because then they know all this is safe, or they do that, But yeah, generally, they'll put it there or there. You put your next objective 3 hexes away, because if you put it 4, then depending on the board, they can put another hex there. So you put your second there, then they realize they can't place that objective where they want to, so now they'll have to place it closer to you, and then you'll place another one, say, further back, wherever you want. And the last one, depending on the board as well, they've chosen this. They actually now would have to go somewhere like that. And you may go, oh, you know what, John, you haven't actually denied them having 3 objectives, but it's really good at making them put it closer, because they would have liked this all the way back. So there's another way to use long configuration. So as I said, the main way is generally people trying to play keep away, especially like elite control warbands, they'll try and do this. Aggro warbands who are trying to box in the opponent, as well as players trying to mitigate getting that third objective. Now, it's really good, once again, if they pick a board with blocked hexes, because, for example, if they had a blocked hex here, let me try to show it on another board. Let's say they put the Shyishian Stardial down. So they go, I'll put my first objective here. Then you can go, I'll put the next one. You would place it there, and then they would have to go here, and that's all blocked off because of the blocked hex. It's made things more difficult for them. So they put another objective there, you put another objective there, and they would effectively have to bounce it forward. So if you're trying to punish someone, let's say you're a hold objective player and you want that third objective closer to you, and they've picked a board with a blocked hex, so it's something to block along these paths, then you can use this configuration to basically get a third objective closer to you. So this is another way of using long configuration. But my biggest tip is just practice. You may hate it, but always just try and play long configuration, even if it's just once a week or something. Because the more comfortable you get with playing it, it shows you the strengths and weaknesses of your decks and playstyles. And yeah, it's something, a tool in your toolbox, because it's a very rare configuration and you can use the tricks to catch people off guard. Because people are generally prepared for the other configurations, because long is awkward and rare. And it can make people go on tilt, because the moment you place long configuration, they go, oh, he's a control player, he's just going to stall this out. So if they're that kind of player, you're already in their head, and that will cause them to make mistakes. So it's why important you should always learn long configuration. Okay, so now we have probably the most common configuration after wide is diagonal. Now, it's quite easy to guess why, because it's diagonal. So the first thing to address here is, as the time of writing, in the core rulebook, it says it should only be a 3 hex gap, minimum. But as of the organized play rules, it's 4. So I expect it will go to 4. So that's just something to be aware of. Now, this is actually the longest point-to-point distance to travel from. So that's why Long board is more of a visual misconception. Diagonal configuration is actually the furthest to travel to point. This is a key thing to remember. So why would you want to do diagonal configuration? The biggest thing to point out is anything counts as diagonal configuration, even if it's just 1 hex offset. So, for example, that would count as diagonal, even though it's really small. So it can go from this massive, just 1 hex away to the 4 hex offset. And this is the important thing. So generally, when you're using this, you want to go the 4 hex offset because that gives you the maximum denial. And the reason you would use diagonal configuration is for aggro denial. It's much better than longboarding because the problem is if you try and longboard an aggro player, eventually they will box you in. So at least with this, while they're trying to get in, you can move around and potentially escape around them, especially if they've funneled in everywhere. Another great use for this is if you're an aggro player and let's say you're an elite aggro warband against a horde warband, swarm warband. So it's warbands with like 6 to 7 fighters. Now the issue is you don't want to run in there because they can overwhelm you. But with this 4 hex gap, especially if it's mostly range 1 fighters, you can mitigate how many people they can get in. So instead of charging one of your fighters in and then having them have potentially 3 fighters clawing your back, you can now force 1-to-1 engagements or 1-to-2, which is either way much better. That's another reason. But the main reason people use this is aggro denial. Because 4 hex used to be free, but the 4 hex gap is far smaller than long configuration. So it's even more difficult for enemy aggro players to get in. And especially, we'll come to lethal hex placement soon. If you put a lethal hex there, you've effectively made it a 3 hex gap. So what you're doing this is to slow down enemy movement to get to you and also not box yourself in because you still have lots of space to move around. And as I said, if they've come too far in, you can generally escape. So in summary, for diagonal configuration, the main reason you would use this board is once again as a control player, but you're mainly doing it, or even a hold objective player, but you're trying to do it to slow down aggro, right? This is the most damaging board to an aggro player because you're already making it far more difficult for them to get in and slowing down how much they can get in. So they may be able to charge you earlier than compared to long configuration, but you're allowing a lot less of their fighters to get in. And it also, as I said, gives you room to maneuver around them. And it's also really good to place if you've got blocked hexes or lethal hexes on the board, because you can make this a nightmare for that choke point. And then on the other hand, as an aggro player, you may use this against a swarm or like horde warband who you also feel might be aggressive, such as the Grimwatch, because you're trying to mitigate the numbers disadvantage. Because as I said, you basically can force 1-to-1 trades here without worrying about being overwhelmed by their fighters when you send someone in. But this is something you really need to get used to because there's a lot of flexibility. And I did briefly cover that any kind of gap can be diagonal, but there are generally some matchups where you might want to go, I'll do a slight offset, not like huge, but maybe it's because, let's see, you've got a range 2 fighter and you go, I don't want the rest of his warband in, but from this point, he's got 7 fighters, I've got 5, I've got a range 2 fighter, he has to put someone there, so I can actually go first and get a kill, and then go on from there. So yeah, something to learn. Wide is really simple. Long is a very tech choice, and it can be intimidating to you and your opponent. And then wide is the most controlling, really. It's very anti-aggro. So if there were boards you were trying to definitely learn, it's wide configuration and diagonal. Now, as we've covered what the configurations are for boards, the next thing is what type of boards. So this is my own terminology, but it's basically, I classify boards into 3 types. You have your foundation board, the board you would place first. You have your reaction board, a board you would always place in response to an opponent's board, and then a flex board, which is a board which fluctuates as it can be good as a foundation or reaction, but it doesn't really do either really well. Now, once again, I would advise reading the article because the article will have the up-to-date list of boards. Because once again, just to make sure this video is actually watchable without me having to have to continually remake it, I will be covering the starter set boards because they don't rotate out. But if you always want an up-to-date classification of boards, because as I said, I go through each board and classify it, I would recommend the article, which can be found in the episode description. But let's classify what the starter set boards are according to me. So first up is the Mirror Well. Once again, this is found in the Warhammer Underworlds starter set, but if you're a Shadespire player, you'll be very familiar with this board. So the key thing to remember, this board is a reaction board. The reason I consider the Mirror Well as a reaction board is because you can place it first, but then I find it is still too punishable from where its starting hexes are. I feel best when it's reacting to what your opponent places. It works great in this configuration for 3 or 4 fighter warbands as an aggro board. But even then, it's not too bad placings first, especially if you feel your opponent is going to longboard you, because you've got a nice, or diagonal, you've got a nice even set. But I feel this board is much better as a reaction board. So a board you place in response to what your opponent is placing. Because once again, using the Starblood Stalkers, for example, you could put Clacktrock up in the most forward starting hex. And then you've got your other fighters there. So if you wanted to get the early aggro push, you've already got that established, right? And then even if your opponent goes, oh, you know what, you've placed that first, I'm going to spin you around, you still got 3 hexes, which are very close. So overall, reaction board. On the flip side, we have the good old Shyishian Stardial. Now this board, other than being a tongue twister, is actually a flex board. So I think this board is good placing first or second. And it's one of my favorite boards in Warhammer Underworlds. The reason I think it's a flex board is because it also works well with any 3 of the battlefield configurations. So wide, long, and diagonal. And it's extremely powerful with warbands that have fighters of 5 or less. It's exceptionally strong in diagonal configuration because it really slows down their ability to get in. Let me show you why. So as you can see, it's very difficult and annoying for my opponent to get in, as I've effectively got a safe wall. And if I put a lethal hex here or here, I've effectively blocked off parts of the board my opponent will go through, because generally people don't want to run through lethal hexes. So it's really good in diagonal configuration. And even if your opponent tries to punish this board, there's not much they can do because of how the starting hexes are placed. This area is probably prime candidate for being diagonal configurations, but it's not too bad. Next, we have the Cursed Oubliette. This is from Nightvolt. So this is another flex board. It doesn't really excel at any given area, which is why I've classified as a flex board. It's a great all-rounder, especially for warbands with 3 to 4 fighters who just want to sit in the middle of the board. Because, you know, your opponent can punish you with the diagonal configuration here or here, but generally here. So that's something you need to keep in mind. But you can also use it to punish in diagonal configuration. But it's, as I said, generally good to sit in the middle of the board, and especially if you don't know what your opponent is going to do. Because the biggest thing, which I'll cover too soon, is when you don't know what your opponent is going to play. This is when flex boards become really good, because you can just go, I'll place this and see what they are going to do. Because I've got an elite warband with really good movement, so no matter what they can do, I can generally counterplay around that, and I just want to see how they do. So yeah, Cursed Oubliette. And finally, we have the Soul Refractor, the original pyramid. Once again, it's another flex board from Nightvolt. The Soul Refractor works ideally as an anti-warband choice, oddly enough. I use it to punish warbands with lots of range 2 or range 3 fighters, as well as to make fighters such as Snurk likely to kill himself because, you know, he gets damaged by bouncing into blocked hexes. And once again, it's a great board because it's difficult to punish, because if someone goes long, Sure, they can go here, but you've got one starting hex right up close to them and another one fairly decently close. And if they go on the other side, you've got 3 very close. So it's a difficult board to punish, but this is more of a tech board. So the Soul Refractor is really important for that, especially with lots of enemy fighters that have range 2 attacks or range 3, because you can use these block hexes to block line of sight and affect their movement. So not only is this a good flex board, it's probably one of the best boards in the game, but you need to use it wisely. Now, for clarity's sake, just because none of the starter set boards are actually foundation boards, here's what I consider a good foundation board. So this is the Menhirs of Binding from the Diachasm core set. Now, this is a great foundation board, as it's difficult to punish and great to place once again if you're exactly unsure of what your opponent is going to do. The lack of lethal hexes and having 2 blocked hexes allows for some safe defensive play, although you'll likely still want to place a single feature token in the middle of your only 2 adjacent starting hexes to keep them safe from enemy lethal hex placement, but that's something I'll cover shortly. But as you can see, really difficult to punish, nice even spots, is very safe to place first, especially if you're unsure about what your opponent is going to do. So if you've won the boards, or you're forced to place first and you have no idea what your opponent is going to do, based on their warband anyway, place the Menhirs of Binding, one of the best foundation boards they've released. So another key point to remember with board placement is when you're playing competitive games, you have to remember there's a new organized play rule. So you can't use the same board more than once in a best of 3 game. So effectively, you have to place 3 unique boards. So you can't use the same board over and over again. So that means you really need to get comfortable with having at least 3 boards you know inside and out. So you ideally want 1 reaction board, 1 foundation board, and 1 flex board. That's very easy to do with the core set because it's, well, the starter set, because you get 4 game boards, which are fairly straightforward. So ideally, I would always personally try and learn the best 4 boards which suits your playstyle and your warband. And the best way to do this is just set up the boards against yourself. Just because that's what I used to do. If I wanted practice for a board configuration, I would just roll out and see, okay, I lose, I'll place first. And I'd find out what would be the best way to set up if I wanted to be aggressive, and which board offered me that, as well as which board gave me the best defensive option, or which board I could place if I got the unoptimal placement and I had to place first. What board could I place to offset being forced to place a board first? All those kind of things that the only way you can really learn is via practice, unfortunately. And it's something you have to just do by yourself. That's what I did. So hopefully that helps for you. Now, the other big question is when you win boards, what do you do? You now may think as a hold objective player, or if I win the board roll, I am going to place boards first all the time. And you actually may not want to do that. And the biggest reason you may not want to do that is against against an aggro player. Because, yeah, you may get all 3 objectives, but then they will just play wide. So you've got all 3 objectives, but now they're in your face. But if you're a smart hold objective player, you would actually go wide configuration, because you slow down the aggro player getting in, and you should have the mobility tools to get that 3rd objective if you need it. I mean, a lot of hold objective decks now only need to work on holding two objectives or even more, but they need a minimum of 2. But ideally, if you want that 3rd objective, you should have the movement to tech into that, because the offset is, well, now you're card dependent basically to get that 3rd objective in enemy territory, but you actually slow down your opponent, because there's no point getting 3 objectives if your opponent's just going to run into your face and maul you. So that's an important thing to remember. Other reasons, of course, if you're playing a hard aggro player, you want to if you win the roll-off, you want to make them place boards first because you want to punish the aggro player. And if you're a control player, obviously you want to place the aggro player first. But if you're an aggro player and you think your opponent's going to try and run away, you make them place first so you can box them in. Now, that's assuming you know the main archetypes of the game and how warbands play. And that's a complex subject. So you're kind of going to have to learn what warbands do in general. So a key thing to remember, don't always assume everything for a warband, because one of the best strengths about Warhammer Underworlds is warbands can be played differently based on the player. And generally warbands can play any playstyle. Now, if they're good at it is another question. But that's something to remember. For example, Steel Hearts champions in the Shadespire days. If you're up against a player who was Steel Hearts champions, they were either hard control or hard aggro. Now, if you gave them boards and then longboarded them so they could set up the back, you've just kind of given them that game, especially if you're struggling to get in. But then on the flip hand, if you set it as wide and you let them come in really early, you've done your job. You've done their job for them. So that's why you need practice. And because how warbands flex and change, and because we have like over 30 warbands now, I can't really tell you how to set up against each warband or what board to pick. It's going to take practice. But that's the great thing about a best of 3, because even if you get it wrong the first time, say you win the second time, then you can effectively go, oh, I know how you're going to play now. So you're an aggro player. I thought you were going to play quite defensively, but I was wrong. You're very aggressive. I'm going to diagonal configuration you. So you're going to take a while to get in. I can learn more of what you're trying to do while I'm building up, and then I should be able to counter you. But that's pretty much it for boards. Just remember always to practice, even if you're just setting up boards by yourself. That's a great skill to have. Learn the boards, all of them if you can, but if you just want a minimum, try and pick 2 game boards, aka 4 boards. So pick 4 boards you're comfortable with, and then you should always be fine. And if you want a live living update of the boards, check out my article in the episode description below for board placement, because I keep it up to date. And the most important thing, if you want to read how to gauge threat ranges, the best thing about that article I made is because it's linked to a board placement article written by Dave Sanders in White Dwarf. Now, you would have to pay it because it's a online White Dwarf, which you can find, but it's a really good article. It basically writes out how I and other competitive players see board placement. So I highly recommend that. So now we come to objective placement. One of the biggest aspects. So you've seen how long I've talked about boards, and I was trying to summarize it as best as I can. All of these things are very deep subjects, and it really does depend on your warband, because depend on its movement and the cards you have, and the opponent you're playing against can massively affect how you want to place your feature tokens. So if you've won boards, let's say you're a hold objective player, how are you going to place your first 3 objectives? Now, assuming no lethal hexes, you're going to try and obviously, let's say you've picked you've picked the 3 objectives. First board, your opponent's like, I'm an aggro player, bam, we're doing wide. How would you put your objectives? So if you're going for a generally defensive play, my first tip is before you place your first objective. Now, it's very easy to go, I'm going to go left to right. And I've seen lots of players do it. You go, I'm going to put that there. And then your opponent goes, okay, I'm going to put my next objective there. And then they've basically stopped you from placing an objective there. Because your ideal setup would have been, I'll put my first objective on the left, my next one will go here, my last one will go here. Something like that. Or you wanted to go, I'll put my one there, and then I'll put my last one like on an edge hex here. But because they've gone, okay, you've put your first objective, feature token there, I'm going to put my next one there. You now can't actually place anywhere because of the edge hex rule and 2 hex gap. So now you have to go, I'll place one there because it's close. They'll place another one there, and then you can place your last one on an edge hex. And you go, oh, that's not so bad. I've still got 3, but you've wanted this one further away from your opponent, and it's now closer. So a canny aggro player can catch you off guard. So my biggest tip, if you're a hold objective player, place your first hex in the hex that will anchor the rest of your objectives. So if you, for example, put your feature token here, no matter where your opponent goes, they now can't stop you putting it closer. So they now can't effectively go, oh, I'll put that there, and then you can just go, cool. No, you put your last one, and I've got 4 objectives. So that's something to keep in mind. Because even though it may seem crazy that your opponent would use their first objective placement to put it in your territory, it's something a canny aggro player will do to deny your easy objective placement, as it brings you closer to them. And once again, yeah. So if you're a hold objective player, place the first feature token in your anchor hex. That's what I like to call it. So you can basically anchor the rest of your feature token placements after that one. Now, as an aggressive player, how would you place your objectives? So once again, as I've just covered now, let's say you've got a very relaxed hold objective player and they put their first feature token there. As I said, you go, you know what? I'm going to place my next one there. And once again, you force them to come forward to you. So that's one simple thing. And as I covered with longboarding, so assuming this is the board for the long configuration, let's see, they put their first objective here or here. If you put that 3 hexes away, you force them to place it closer. And you're not too concerned about giving them this objective because all it's going to do, as I covered in long configuration, is bring objectives closer to them, closer to you, so they have to go further. Because the key thing as an aggro player, you want to make the hold objective player work to get on those objectives. If they have to burn cards to get on objectives, even better. Because a hold objective player is actually terrified, not if you can get onto the objectives, but if you can charge someone. So you have to gauge threat ranges. Now, one important thing as a hold objective player is remember the threat ranges of your opponent's fighters. So if they've got a 4 hex movement with a range 1 attack, they've got a threat range of 5 hexes. So you may only actually be able to keep one objective safe. But depending on your board, let's just flip the mirror well around. But depending on your board, you could place one feature token there and another there. And that would keep those 2 really safe. And you got a third one there. So this is more of an optimal deployment. But then you need to remember, generally hold objective decks need to reach another objective in enemy territory, just for extra security as well as to kind of mess up your opponent's threat range. Because if you've just boxed yourself in the back, your opponent would just go, oh, well, this player's partly boxed themselves in, I just have to move in. If you can get behind them and get onto other objectives, they have to break away fighters to get that one who's trailing back. And it just gives you extra reliability. So that's why, this is great, but you can also place them behind blocked hexes, especially against range fighters. Like, let's go with the Shyishian Stardial. Placing a feature token there is a great way, especially against range 2 or 3 fighters, because that will block line of sight. No, that won't block line of sight, but you've basically blocked all this area off. And if you put a lethal there, you can kind of keep this feature token really safe. So it's about remembering threat ranges and how safe you can keep an objective. Now, if you're an aggro player, once again, you're either going to try and place your feature tokens to punish their placement, or you're going to use it defensively. Now, this is something I'll cover more in lethal hex placement, but when you select your board, as you know, when you get to place lethal hexes, it's optional, but you should always mind on your board where you can use feature tokens to keep that starting hex safe. Now, for example, there's not much you can do here, but let's flip around to the mirror well. So I'm an aggro player. I'm trying to get in there. That person's got the 3 objectives. I don't care. So before in Shadespire, before we had that lethal hex placement rule, you would commonly see aggro players go, I'll put one objective here and I'll put one here, super far back. So your hold objective player has to get to you. And that's completely valid. But because of how lethal hex placement works in Diachasm, or Beastgrave, likely for ongoing, you can actually make placing a lethal hex safe in terms of now your opponent can't punish where they're going to place their lethal hex. So a key thing to look out for is 2 or more starting hexes that are adjacent to each other or in each other like a bubble. So the great thing about the mirror well, it shows both of these. So you have 2 starting hexes here. So if I'm an aggro player and I'm going to run forward, first thing I'm going to do, place a feature token here. Now you may go, oh, John, but you're bringing this objective closer to the opponent. And that is correct. But if I allowed my opponent to place a lethal hex there, they've made both of these starting hexes a risk, because generally hold objective players will have some sort of aggro. So if they throw a fighter in, tap there, they can drive back and either severely damage one of my fighters or even kill them. And the problem is, placing a lethal hex there makes both of these starting hexes unsafe. So I can put a feature token there and, you know, subjective 1 or whatever. Now, if they want to place a lethal hex, they can only do so here or here or here. But, you know, you can go, well, you know, one of them is still at risk of being lethal. And I go, that's correct, but it's gone from 2 to 1. And it's even better in like bubbles of bubble of starting hexes. So for example here. Now I've made one of those safe instead of both of them being terrible. Because yeah, you need to identify which one you want to save first. So ideally, I'm not too concerned about this starting hex going, right? Because if you're against a canny player, especially if you think they're going to play hold objectives and they turn out not to, when you're trying to place your first feature token as an aggro player, make sure if you're trying to make a starting hex safe, make that your first feature token placement. So I would do it here, because if my opponent was actually playing aggro and put one there, they can now make all of these dangerous. Because yeah, objective token here, that objective, well, it basically stops the lethal hex going there, you know, stops the drive back. So you have two choices as an aggro player. You can either place objectives at the back of the board, as far back from the opponent as possible, or you can place them more forwards, but that's in order to keep starting hexes safe from lethal hex placement. Now, another reason you may want to deploy the feature tokens closer to the opponent as an aggro player is because you know hold objective players will have a lot of movement tech. You will have it as well. But if you put these objectives closer, sure, they can move on to these objectives even easier, but you don't have to worry about chasing them. Because the worst thing you can have as an aggro player, you're running deep into their territory and they run like fighters onto this objective or this objective, which are all the way back. Or even if you do something like that and you go, oh, I don't have any cards that can push them off objectives. I have to send my fighters in. And then if you have to send fighters back, they've broken away from the main force. And, you know, having one fighter trying to save these two objectives from the enemy, it's pretty much impossible. It's breaking away your fighters, breaking them apart, meaning your opponent can go, oh, you know, I couldn't deal with 3 of his fighters, but I can deal with 2, or I can deal with 1-on-1. So if you place your feature tokens closer to the objectives where your opponent it may make it easier for the opponent, but you can actually corral the fighting into here. And, you know, especially if they've put all their objectives at the back of the board, you could put them quite close, and then this part of the board can be ignored. So even though you're playing wide configuration, the board is actually now this. So this all is ignored because no one's actually going to be here, because you're going to deploy here and charge forward. And if your opponent does run into your territory, they're only going to these objectives here. So something to remember. So the only other thing I'll touch on for diagonal configuration for board placement, I mean for a feature token placement anyway, is you'd probably go here or here. Because remember, you're only going to, let's say you're a hold objective player, you've let the aggro player place boards first. So you've got, let's say, 2 objectives. This is how you're going to place them. And, you know, you can make a lethal hex there so they can't get in. So you've got, you know, one safe objective. And even then, this objective is going to take them forever to get to. And your opponent may put all 3 at the back, for example, as well. But if you can secure 2 objectives really easily and then make like a defensive choke point where your opponent will just move in and then you can start attacking, that's really good. So this is something to remember if you're a hold objective player. And as always remember to take extra movement and just move tech in general so you can actually get that. Because the key thing, you're probably going to use this a lot as in terms of this white diagonal configuration, because it slows down the aggro player. you only have two feature tokens, but you stop yourself getting slaughtered, because the worst thing you could do, especially in Dire Chasm, the current season, as a hold objective player, is to go, I'll place boards first. You get the 3 objectives, and your opponent just runs in. Just like, even if you go like that, and you put a lethal hex there, they can still just box you in and then wipe you, especially with how fast everyone is. So just something to remember. So now we come to lethal hex placement. I've covered boards and I've covered objective placement. And with lethal hex placement, I've written an article, which I highly recommend checking down in the episode description below. It's just something you can follow on from, because I haven't actually written one for objective placement, because I've just given a brief overview, but with lethal hex placement, there's a lot more you can do. And I've tied them in because objective and lethal hex placement work together. So there are key things you need to remember about for lethal hex placement. So the first thing is how this mechanic works. So the person to place the last feature token, which is the 5th one, gets the option to place a lethal hex first. So before even placing a lethal hex, the key thing to remember, it's entirely optional. Neither you or your opponent have to do it. It's a choice, and you can simply just pass as well as your opponent. But you generally always want to place a lethal hex. Now, there's multiple ways to do this, but I'll be covering that shortly. And a key thing to remember with lethal hex placement is you cannot place a lethal hex adjacent to another lethal hex, or one that's already on the board. So for example, you can't place a lethal hex next to one and effectively cause this kind of double blockage. They always have to be 1 hex apart. So there's some spacing to remember. There's generally a balance thing to stop crazy lethal hex configurations, but that's it. You need to remember it's the person who places the last feature token gets the option to place a lethal hex first, and then after they have placed one, you can place one, and it's entirely optional. You don't have to place a lethal hex. And the last one is they cannot be placed adjacent to each other. There always has to be a minimum of a 1 hex gap, which is very important. So a key thing to remember, which I've already covered with objective hex placement, is you may actually be using your objectives not because you want to stand on them, but to keep starting hexes safe from lethal hex placement. So for example, I've been a crazy aggro player. I've actually not kept that safe. So my opponent could either put lethal hex there or there. And that's really bad for me as the aggro player. Because even if they don't actually run into me, they could push me into there with cards and then actually make it even worse for me to charge in, because now I'm charging in with a wounded fighter. But even with the threat of lethal hexes, you can actually use it to punish people you think are going to be very predictable. So the biggest and most simple way is to place it behind an objective hex. Now, the reason you want to place it behind is the direction from where you're attacking, because you actually want to drive an opponent into this lethal hex. And the reason you want to do that is to make this feature token and objective hex as undesirable as you can for your opponent to get onto it. So let me show with some warbands. So before I get into placing warbands, you have to remember this is done before fighters are placed. So I'm the aggro player, right? I want to get in there. Where am I going to put my lethal hex? So let's say my opponent goes first. They've placed the last feature token, so they'll go, you know what? We know where the objectives are. This person has actually kept their starting hexes safe. I'm actually going to probably place my lethal hex here, because it makes this starting hex risky, and even if they move on to this one, it's not too bad. Or they may place it somewhere in no man's land to try and make it more difficult to get to me. But let's say, for example, they want to do this here. They can potentially threaten me. Now, where would I place mine? So if you think your opponent is, from where they've set on the objectives, they're going to sit far back, you would generally place a lethal hex here or there. And especially if you feel they're going to go into the back corner, you could put a lethal there, although I would advise against it. If you're trying to put a lethal hex behind an objective, you want to do it in such a way where you can drive them back after an attack. Because if you think about it, that's a free damage. And you can't really drive back someone if they're in the corner. So that's probably where I wouldn't place a lethal hex if you're an aggro player. Ideally, you would want to place it behind an objective you can attack. So let's make it easier. Put it behind 2 because, I'm going to go, at least I can make that a threat. I can work my way around, so it's going to be dangerous. Now I'll demonstrate with some fighters. So here we go. I'm the Ripper Snarlfangs player. I want to get in as quickly as I can, but you'll notice I've still deployed actually Ripper next to that lethal hex. So even though that is incredibly risky, generally if you're an aggro player against a hold objective warband, you should be gaining priority because generally you'll have less fighters than them. And, even if they charge in, I've got my range 3 fighter who can provide a counter attack. So even if you charge into my leader and win priority, I've still got a good chance. Probably wiser way would actually be to put it like this. But even then you would go, oh, John, that's crazy putting a fighter there. As the hold objective player, on the other hand, they've gone, you know what, I'm going to put my big brawler up front just to make this even more dangerous for my opponent to try and psych them out to force them to deploy back. But you still deploy up front. So this kind of forces you into a situation where you have to go first. But at least even if you go first, you can kind of attack. And if anyone moves onto objective, you can stab back, for example. But let's say, for example, this is how the setup. You've got Kizzy Taka. He's got 3 wounds. He's on that feature token. He's on objective 2. And I actually, I'm going to just throw my leader in. And let's say I succeed. I do 2 damage. My leader's 2 damage. Now, I will drive him back into the lethal, and that's actually killed a 3 wound fighter or severely wounded someone else. Because even if the attack fails, you can drive them back into the lethal for 1 damage. And that's the main way you're placing lethal hexes if you're trying to punish hold objective players. Because not only do you make objective 2 really unsafe for the opponent where that lethal hex is, they have to put double investment to make it safe. So the hold objective player can go, you know what, I'll put this fighter on guard, and then in my next activation, I'll move them on to the objective where you've placed the lethal hex behind. But that's a win-win situation for you, because either they've invested cards solely to go on guard, or they're spending 1 activation to go on guard and then another activation to move. So that's slowing down their ability to get on all of the objectives. And even if they go on guard, you can then charge and potentially kill that fighter and slow them down even more. So it basically makes tons of pressure for the opponent without even having attacked. You've done all this already. And of course, they've done it back to you. But then if you're a free fire warband, you don't really care about that. If you're a full fire warband, it's a problem. But you have to remember, if your opponent's trying to punish you with lethal hex placement, you generally only have to worry about that in this matchup, aggro against hold objective, for the first activation. The moment you move away from that lethal hex, it's no longer a problem. That lethal hex there is always going to be a problem the entire game for this hold objective player. Now, I'll briefly go over it again, just because this is the lethal hex segment. So once again, if you're on a board, you want to look, and you're an aggro player, you want to look at the hexes. Even if you're playing defensively, you want to look at the hexes you can keep safe with feature tokens. Because remember, that placing a lethal hex there makes both of these unsafe, these 2 starting hexes. But at least if you place a feature token there, you make only one of them unsafe. So it's a huge thing to remember. Even as when you're playing defensively, let's say you've got 2 starting hexes in the middle, you can place a feature token behind that. Now the 2 starting hexes are safe because the aggro player is going to run in. So not only have you placed a nice objective for yourself, you've also stopped your opponent, basically making it even more dangerous for you and tons of more pressure that you don't need as a hold objective player. Now, not only can you place lethal hexes behind objectives, generally you'll place them in the first game if you're not sure how your opponent is going to do. Because you remember, even against control players, they may set the feature tokens like that, but they might not even think about going in on the objectives. So where would you put the lethal hexes in that case? So key thing is just in between starting hexes. So let's say I know my opponent is going to basically just sit at the back of the board and try and play keep away. I would actually put a lethal hex here or even there. And you may go, oh, why? Because let's say my opponent is just going to sit fighters in that starting hex. Now, once again, it's instead of making a feature token or objective unsafe, you've made that starting hex unsafe. And you could put it here, but the other problem is your opponent will generally just move away from there, making that kind of moot and more difficult for you to actually use effectively. But if you put on the back of an edge hex like there, your opponent will now have to move that fighter on the back hex, which they didn't want to do, or they'll have to put them on guard. So either way, you've now forced them to activate that fighter that they didn't want to, or invest cards to push them away from the starting hex, because they're like, there's a lethal hex next to me. So the key points to remember when placing lethal hexes in such a way to punish your opponent is either to punish where they're actually placing up, and let's say they were careless and set their feature tokens like that. You now go, bam. Because especially if you're going to run in, you've made those two starting hexes unsafe. So now the controlling player here has to move both of those fighters away to make that safe. And especially if they're playing defensively, you've now messed up their efficiency of trying to deny you glory, because you're now denying them the ability to sit back and draw cards or try and control the game. But yeah, if you're unsure, especially against, well, if you're unsure in general, placing behind a feature token is the safest bet, because either way, if they weren't going to use the objectives, it's not a big loss. But if you know they're going to sit at the back of the board, placing it on the back row like that against starting hexes is a great thing to do. Not so much in the corner, but once again, it's to punish fighters who aren't actually intended to activate. Let's say I'm the hold objective player. You know, I'm actually not trying to use these lethal hexes aggressively. How can I use them defensively? It's quite simple. Most commonly, you've done diagonal configuration. You place a lethal hex there, you're against an aggro opponent. You've made that 4 hex gap, a 3 hex gap effectively, because generally aggro players are not going to run through that. If they're trying to run around to get to that objective, you made it even longer, but you've also blocked off more of the board. And especially with like the Shyishian Stardial as we've got here, you could also place one there and effectively make this part of the board safe. More safe than it was already. But generally, you would place it there. And if there's more lethals or blocked hexes, for example, we've got a great blocked hex selection on the Shyishian Stardial, you've basically made only 2 points on the game board your opponent can move through safely. And even with crazy movement, they would end here or here. And if they end here, you can trap them by attacking from this point if you've got a range 2, because once again, they can't be driven back, so they're trapped. If you're crazy, you can go there. And if they move around here, you can kind of block that off with fighters and punish very easily. So if they charge someone in, don't kill them, you can drive them back and use their own fighter to block other enemy fighters getting in. And even then, like 2 hex gap. But for example, this is probably the best one because it's 1 hex gap, 1 hex gap. So that's how you can use them defensively with just one board. Even if your opponent may go, you know what, I'm going to do that to you. You can go, fine. I'm going to make that really difficult for you to get in because I can actually bide my time before getting onto that objective, and it's going to be far more difficult for you to get in and move around. I've even seen players spend a round, move their fighters all around here, then in round 2, then move around here because of this denial of movement. Now, you could do this as a hold objective player or even as control. This is a great way to counter aggro. As an aggro player, there's not much you can do. Just make sure you've tried to align boards correctly. But if it's done to you as an aggro player and you've had to place boards first, well, you're just going to have to hope you draw enough movement cards to get around this. It does suck, but it's an important part of the game to stop aggro rolling over the opponent. So another neat way you can use lethal hexes defensively is actually to make objectives safe. So this was tech I developed at the start of Beastgrave, because there's a card called Restless Prize, which allows you to move feature tokens, but not through lethal hexes. So this was a big problem because people would bring your lethal hex. Well, you put your objective here, and they would bring it out. Well, you put it here, right? They'd bring it out, make it annoying for you to protect. Because you can't move feature tokens, well, objectives through lethal hexes. If you place a lethal hex here, not only have you made that board safe, but now if my opponent goes, I'm going to play Restless Prize or a card that moves an objective, because they can't move it into a lethal hex, all they can do is just go move that one or that one. And you could say, well, they'll just pick the other objective to move. But I've effectively kept one objective safe from that card, and that's without using any cards. And I've even managed to efficiently place that lethal hex, so it's not only making it harder for my opponent to get in, but I've also messed up their ability to move my objective closer to them and harder for me to defend. This is very niche, and especially with rotation, when Restless Prize rotates out, it's going to be not that useful, but it's something to keep in mind. So it's another defensive way to use lethal hexes. So here's another interesting setup I wanted to show. So these are boards with actual lethal hexes on them. Now, to keep this relevant, these are the Diachasm boards. So this is the Amber Trap Nest, and then you got the Pool of Fangs. So these should be quite relevant for a while, because the starter set boards don't have any lethal hexes on them. So I already placed some lethal hexes already. So let's assume I'm a 4-fighter warband against an aggro warband that wants to come in. Playing a bit hold objective-y, so I've got, my safe objectives. Probably not the best board for this kind of deployment, but I wanted to show off the lethal hexes. So my opponent has gone, bam, you've got 3 lethal hexes here. And you go, John, why would you want to put an objective here? So if my opponent charges in, let's say they're range 1, which a lot of fighters are nowadays, they charge in here, or they charge in here. Either way, they're now next to a lethal hex. So sure, they can dunk me into a lethal hex, but then I can dunk them right back in. So it makes them easier to kill and makes them riskier to run through. And I've already blocked off their deployment, right? So if I was a 3-fighter warband, I've got 1, 2, 3, and then they've got only 2 hexes that can get in easily. Even if I'm a 4-fighter warband and I've gone 1, 2, 3, 4, if they run through here to get to this fighter, they're going to take a damage. And especially if I can go, oh, you know what? I'll attack you, drive you back, and then potentially, if that attack has failed, I can charge and push you in. It's a good punishment, right? But you can also use your lethal hexes on the board defensively. Because remember, a lethal hex cannot be placed within 1 hex of another lethal hex. So depending on the board, the way you deploy this is you can make this very safe for yourself, even as an aggro player. Because you can also use it to help guide where, your opponent actually can't place a lethal hex. Because look at the Amber Trap Nest. You've got 2 lethal hexes with 1 gap. So if your opponent's going to place a lethal hex, they can't do one here, they can't place one here, here, or here. So if you placed an objective here, sure, your opponent could place a lethal hex here or here, they can't do one there. So you can actually make this fairly safe. Obviously, you can't do it in this alignment, but that's a key thing to remember. Because you could even do that, but that's like probably an unoptimal lethal hex placement, because you can go, oh, you know what? These 3 are like basically 1 hex apart. And then you're like, yeah, but your opponent will just run around. They can ignore that. This one, you're manipulating the lethal hexes on the board to force a corridor of death, especially if you've got fighters here, because you can block off where they want to go, because they can go, oh, I'll charge around here, get your fighter there. It's like, cool. You either kill or fail to attack, then I can dunk you back on. So, that's ways you can use lethal hexes on the board. But this is kind of like your typical setup. So with this setup, it's a little more different. This is how you would ideally use the Amber Trap Nest. So you've used it as a reaction. Let's say you're a 4-fighter warband. You've got 4 Stein hexes, 1, 2, 3, 4. You can sit quite back. Once again, you're using the Amber Trap Nest, but in a diagonal configuration. But, you're playing against an aggro player. You've let them place boards first, and you've gone with this. So I've just put the fighters there to help imagine it, right? So the reason I've put a feature token there is well, so ignore that this warband is actually immune to lethal hexes. But if I let my opponent place a lethal there, it makes so when they charge in, they can go dunk, or they can just charge around and push more of my fighters in. At least this way, I've made it, really annoying. They're not going to put a lethal here or here, so they'll just put it behind like the objective. And either way, that's fine, because they put it actually really far back. There's enough stuff in the way to make using this lethal hex really difficult for them, unless they've got like range 2 or 3 attacks. Even then, it's not too much to worry about. And then I would probably place a lethal hex here, because you really want to look for blocked hexes that will force the opponent in, or even doing it here, because once again, always a safe bet to place the lethal hex in diagonal configuration like this, because only 1 hex gap, that's always a 1 hex gap. You're corralling the opponent. This is an ideal setup. And even then you can learn using all the tips and tricks. So this is kind of combining everything, because that has kept, like that player has basically kept their starting hexes safely. They've put a feature token in the middle of 3 starting hexes, just in case, this, because you may not know how your opponent is going to place their lethal hexes. So this is like the most optimal way to punish and then hope for the best as well. And that's pretty much it on lethal hex placement. It's a very important part. So once again, you remember the first lethal hex can be placed by the person who finishes placing the last feature token. It's an optional mechanic, so you and your opponent don't have to place lethal hexes. And then they have to be 1 hex apart, so you can't place lethal hexes together. And then you can either use lethal hexes to punish hold objective players by putting a lethal hex behind the feature token, objective token, or next to a starting hex on an edge hex for an opponent you think is going to sit at the back of the board and try and play keep away. So when you do go in for that charge, you can punish them back. And then also you can use them defensively, such as in diagonal configuration here, making that 4 hex gap a 3 hex gap, or on any board with lots of blocked and or lethal hexes, because you can make, especially in diagonal configuration, very unsafe paths or even block off part of the boards for your opponent, because it's a psychological thing. Generally, there's actually no real harm from charging for a lethal hex. Sure, it's 1 damage, but if it's a 4-wound fighter, that's not a big loss. But some players don't want to do that because they know how explosive damage is, and bringing a 4-wound fighter down to 3 wounds is pretty much a death knell, especially if they have no healing. So that's one way to use them. And then also you have to tie into feature token placement. You want to try and keep objectives, you want to try and keep starting hexes that are adjacent to each other safe by putting a feature token behind them to keep one of them safe instead of having them both exposed to the opponent. So those are some key concepts to remember. And then, as I said, working around the boards. And just as with placing boards, the best practice you can get is just by, when you're trying to find out what boards work best, set up the objectives, set up the feature tokens, and then go from there. But the biggest way is just practice. The other thing to remember, at the moment, you've got the Thorns of the Briar Queen and Lady Harrow's Mournflight, who are immune to lethal hexes. Against those fighters and warbands, just don't place lethal hexes. Just save yourself the hassle. All you're going to do is make it better for them. So if a warband is immune to lethal hexes, don't place them. And, as I said before, it's niche tech, but you can actually use lethal hexes to stop your objectives being pushed forward. As I displayed with the Shyishian Stardial, if you put a lethal hex there and one of your objectives here, your opponent can't use gambits anymore to push that lethal hex through. Push that feature or objective token through the lethal hex. All they can do is just move it around. So yes, they can still disrupt you, but they can no longer bring that objective forward and make it worse for you. Because, for example, say I went like that, my opponent could play a card that moved a feature token like that, or Restless Prize to go from here to here. And that's actually pretty bad for me because now I have to move more forward. But that's, as I said, just a niche thing to remember. And then, as always, remember, you can always reference back to this video or even just the article, which you can find in the episode description. And the best way is just practice. It took me a long time to get comfortable with this and experimentation. And the best way you can do it, as I said, you can just throw things out by yourself. but go crazy when you're playing casual games and just place lethal hexes in strange ways and see what way it benefits your warband. Because it's an integral part and shouldn't be overlooked. Same with placing objectives and placing boards. So yeah, there you have it. That's pretty much everything I know about board placement, objective placement, and lethal hex placement. There's, I still reference the articles, and I've tried to make it make sense by showing boards that won't rotate, because the dangers of only talking about like recent diachasm boards is on rotation they can become out of date quite quickly. So that's why I used the starter set board, which I clarified in the video anyway. So I hope it was clear. It still is a long, deep subject. And my real best advice is, even if you can't get games, a lot of the stuff I did, as I said in the video, was I just practiced by myself. Even before tournaments, back in my Shadespire days, or if I was unsure with the warband, I would line up the boards I have in my collection and go, which one is the most optimal for me? And then which one is the worst for me and which alignments? And I would just spend, maybe an hour or so just aligning boards to find how I can deploy my fighters in such a way where I can mitigate or maximize on these factors. So obviously it makes more sense when you start practicing with real games and real opponents, but it's something you can do. Even on the objective placement side, you can kind of punish yourself really hard and go, how would I react to this? So even if you can't get games in, I would still recommend just practicing by yourself for this subject. And then as for objectives, they're still quite broad because unfortunately it does require a lot of game knowledge from from warband archetypes and playstyles, as well as your familiarity with the game, because the more familiar you become with warbands and playstyles, you can more accurately adapt and predict. But remember not to fall into the trap of just assuming everything, because then you could guess wrong, which I cover in the video. And then lethal hexes, they've kind of lost a bit of tech, just because, the biggest surprise you could do was like Restless Prize and protecting objectives, but that's not so much a big issue. But at least the key points with lethal hexes is trying to punish your opponent or creating choke points, and remembering to actually place objectives to protect yourself from lethals. And you can really use them as a massive psychological pressure, because depending on where you place them, they're either a threat just for the first activation, or they can be potentially a threat for the whole round. It depends on your opponent, and once again, where you put them down on the board. So yeah, that's pretty much everything for my video on board placement, objective placement, and lethal hex placement. I've already got some more tactics videos planned to talk about. If you want to hear them, let me know by liking and subscribing, as well as, just let me know in the comment section below. And if you want me to talk about other subjects or have some more questions, fire off in the comment section, because I'm more than happy to answer. Part of the reasons, the main reason I actually started making content all the way back in Shadespire, was to help people get better in the game. And, it would be easy if I could make short videos talking about key subjects, but I feel like it would be a disservice to you, the viewer, because I wouldn't be telling you everything. So it is long and thorough, but it'll be beneficial to you. If you want to get better at competitive games, especially like Warhammer Underworlds, this is the kind of work and thought you have to put in. So it is tough, but once you've got the hang of it, you generally should remember it, and then it'll be a permanent part of your toolbox for playing Warhammer Underworlds. So until next time, don't get overwhelmed by the perils of board, objective, and lethal hex placement. Because remember, still, if even everything else goes wrong, you always have the ability to roll a crit.